Well, a few years ago, my cousin was traveling through Asia, and as she was going through one of the market stalls, she noticed this really colourful and attractive scarf. And on the tag of the scarf, it said 100% silk. So it was a bit expensive, but she decided to buy it. When she brought it home and she tried the scarf on again, she noticed that there was some writing on the back of the tag. And on the back, it said feeling. So the whole tag said 100% silk feeling. Well, in a very similar way, Satan promotes his world as providing 100% joy, guaranteed. The problem, though, is that Satan can only offer a feeling, something which is temporary, which isn't genuine or lasting joy. Because how can Satan offer something that he himself doesn't have? See, Satan staked his joy on being worshipped and admired by all creation. Now, us being here today in itself proves that that will never happen. And we are part of a universal family who throughout history have shown that we will never worship a wicked and evil being. So instead of being joyful, the Bible and Revelation describe Satan as being hurled to the earth with great anger. But not only does Satan himself lack joy, he's also made it his mission to rip away the joy from as many as possible. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, he's described as being like a roaring lion seeking to devour someone. His sole desire is to harm us and to tear us down. And so is it little wonder then that we live in a world today where joy seems so difficult to find and to maintain? Just for a moment, think about your personal circumstances. What is the biggest challenge that you're facing at the moment to being joyful? Maybe through this pandemic, we've had to deal with negative feelings and emotions, feeling lonely or isolated. And so maybe those thoughts churning through our mind sap us of joy. Or maybe we wonder whether our job is stable, whether we have the finances to provide for our family through this period of time. Or maybe we're dealing with ill health or the loss of a loved one. Do we have that roar from Satan in mind, whether he's directly causing it or indirectly exploiting it? It can make joy difficult. But as we go through our material today, let's see how, despite that roar that we have in our lives personally, it is possible for us to be joyful. Maybe we could just pause and fact check that statement and say, is that even something that is possible, that joy can come despite difficulties? Well, to answer that question, please turn to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 4. Philippians 4 and verse 4. There it says, always rejoice in the Lord. Again, I will say rejoice. Interesting way Paul wrote these words, isn't it? He doesn't say to simply rejoice. He says always rejoice. And almost as if Paul knew that his listeners and even us today are thinking, well, that's just not possible. Look at my trials. Look at my roar. He says it again, rejoice. What's the type of joy that Paul is telling us to always be experiencing? Well, maybe when we think of this quality of joy, we think of a time when we've been joyful. Perhaps we've been on holidays and we've spent a beautiful day with our family and friends. We've had a nice meal and we're sitting watching the sunset. No stress, no anxiety. Is that the type of joy Paul is asking or directing us to always be experiencing? Well, no. And we can say that because just for a moment, think about Paul's circumstances when he wrote these words. Was he staring off at sunsets carefree? Well, in our first illustration, we can see Paul's situation as he wrote these words. He was in prison. He was chained to a Roman guard. He wanted to build up the congregation to continue in his missionary work, but he couldn't. Perhaps he was dealing with the roars of self-doubt and frustration that many of us may be facing when we deal with limitations. But also, Paul, as he reflected on writing to the congregation here in Philippi, would have thought about his last visit about 10 years earlier. There with Silas, he was dragged through the streets by a mob who tore off his clothes, beat him with rods, and in agonizing pain, Paul would have reflected, sitting in prison. Hopefully we have our next illustration there. His back bleeding. In that moment that we see there on the screen, in Paul's current circumstances, was he joyful? Absolutely. Because under inspiration and preserved by the God who cannot lie, Paul tells us in our verse, always rejoice. So we learn a very clear lesson here that the fact that we have difficulties and hardships and roars from Satan doesn't mean that joy is impossible for us to have. And really, we can see in our verse here what the true source of joy is. Do you notice in our verse what Paul says we should always rejoice in? The Lord. It's our relationship with Jehovah that is the basis of our joy. We're created so that the closer we are to Jehovah, the more joyful we will be. Now, we could just pause there and leave our discussion and say, well, I have a relationship with Jehovah, so that must mean that I'm joyful, and I'll always be able to be joyful. But then Monday comes, our roar from Satan reappears, and quickly we can lose our balance. Just knowing the fact that Jehovah is our loving Father won't in itself guarantee us continuous joy. We could liken our joy to a campfire. A fire needs timber to continually be added to that fire so that it can burn strong. And so too, our joy needs fuel constantly to keep it burning brightly. So let's consider 4 areas that can help us to remain joyful. And the first is in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2. And here we're looking at the example of Jesus. There it says, as we look intently at the chief agent and perfecter of our faith, Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, he endured a torture stake, despising shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What was the joy set before Jesus? Is that by remaining faithful, he could vindicate Jehovah's name and sovereignty. Jesus had been present as Satan had come in and hurled abuse at his Father, calling Jehovah an unrighteous ruler who was just bribing us to worship him. And so Jesus viewed it as a joy to be able, through his life course, to prove his loyalty to Jehovah. He showed, despite the difficulties and hardships that he endured, that his love for Jehovah could conquer his self-interest. And in doing so, he showed Satan as a liar. Focusing on that reward helped Jesus to look beyond the present pain and to see a wonderful blessing. Well, we too have this joy set before us by Jehovah. And it's well described by Sister Maria Hombach, who spent over 3.5 years in solitary confinement in Nazi Germany for her neutrality. And this is what she said: I bubbled over with joy, knowing I had the unique privilege of proving my love and gratefulness to Jehovah under the cruelest of circumstances. No one forced me to do this. On the contrary, the ones who tried to force us were our enemies, who tried by threats to get us to obey Hitler more than God. Having a good conscience, I was happy even while behind prison walls. What a joy it has been to love Jehovah while being sustained by him as a friend. Beautiful words, aren't they? And they can be ours too. We can bubble over with joy, just as our sister did. She said that she viewed her trials as a unique privilege to prove her love and gratefulness for Jehovah. Well, likely when we thought of our problem that we've identified, the thought of it being a privilege probably didn't immediately come to our mind. But it is a wonderful honor in the sense that Jehovah allows us by our actions, by our endurance and integrity, to stand up and defend his name and reputation. There's nothing more that we can give Jehovah than our faithfulness and obedience. When we zoom out and we see our trial from Jehovah's perspective, that can give us inner peace and contentment. Sister Maria was able to have that mindset by seeing Jehovah as her best friend. And so there's a little practical point for us to think about in this section. How real of a friendship is Jehovah to us? And more importantly, is our friendship growing? Are we closer to him now than we were 6 months or a year ago? Because the closer we are, the more motivated we'll want to be to remain faithful. One thing that can help our relationship to grow is to look at how we're praying. Particularly when we think of a friendship, are we always praying and talking about our problems, our concerns? Or are we expressing gratitude and thanks? We see on our monitors the illustration of when Jesus faced a stressful period of time. And the Bible tells us that during that period, his sweat was as drops of blood. He poured out all of his emotions and feelings into his prayers. Well, can we do the same? And in doing so, we'll draw close to Jehovah. One sister who did this said, "My love for Jehovah and my trust in him grow each time I express my thoughts to him in prayer. Seeing how Jehovah answers my prayers has helped me to view him as a father and friend." So there's a little formula for us when we think of this first point. The more we pray, the more our love and our relationship with Jehovah will deepen. And then the more we'll want to stand up and endure our trial with joy. Well, let's look at a second point in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 44. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 44. There it says, "The kingdom of the heavens is like a treasure hidden in the field that a man found and hid. And because of his joy, he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field." Well, in our next illustration, we can see this man finding buried treasure. He cannot believe he's found something so precious and valuable. Look at the excitement on his face. But in our verse, notice that Jesus says he can't have both the field and his belongings. He has to go and sell everything he has to be able to have this treasure. So can you imagine this man at night? He's just sold his business, his home, his donkey. He's sitting out in this field and it starts to rain. Is he regretting his decision? Well, absolutely not. Because the value he's placed on his treasure has changed his attitude and his thinking towards material things. And it's caused him to adjust his priorities. Well, similarly for us, joy comes from having the right priorities and sticking to them. And Jesus in our verse tells us what our main priority in life should be. He says, "The kingdom of the heavens is like this treasure." Kingdom truth is precious to us and can be a source of real joy. Just think for a moment about where we would be if we didn't understand Bible truths. Because we have a clear understanding of the Bible, we know why we see suffering around us. We have a purpose in life. We know that God has a name and how to worship him acceptably. We know what our loved ones who have died, their hope that we'll be able to see them again in a beautiful paradise earth. Those truths are a source of real joy for us, just like that man in our illustration. So on a practical level, we could ask ourselves, is seeking kingdom truth my main priority? Now, of course, we can give the right answer. Yes, it should be. But what does our thinking, what we talk about, what we do, what we spend our time, what do they show as our main priorities? Satan wants recreation, entertainment, and material things to subtly creep into our life to the point that we start viewing them as a way to escape our problems and as a way to get joy. And in doing so, they can crowd out our spiritual activities. So if we're lacking joy, a good place for us to start is to look at our routine at the moment, our spiritual routine. Has it started to slip? How is our Bible reading? Are we able to do that and meditate on it daily? How are we going with our family worship? Those activities are so important because they help us to dig up and uncover those spiritual treasures. But maybe our routine is going well, and yet we still feel weighed down and burdened and lacking joy. What can we do then? Well, here's a comment from one brother. He says, at times when I'm feeling a little discouraged or anxious, I pick up the Bible and meditate on a passage of scripture. I feel that it really calms me down. So when we have disquieting thoughts and sapping and the sap of joy, can we buy out time to seek out Bible truth even more? And maybe as we're traveling to work, we can listen to the audio recordings. Some have written down scriptures and put it in their phone or stuck it on the fridge. It's just a way to reset their thinking through the day, to ride out the waves of anxiety. Whatever we can do to inject spiritual thoughts into our mind and Jehovah's thinking can help us to gain strength and tap into Jehovah's power. The amount of time and energy we put into uncovering spiritual truths through our routine is like the fuel that we can put on a fire. We could put a twig which flames out after 30 seconds, or we could put a log that intensifies that fire. Well, so far we've looked at two ways that we can gain joy. Let's look at a third in James chapter 1 and verses 2 to 4. In James chapter 1, there in verse 2, it says, "Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you meet with various trials, knowing as you do that this tested quality of your faith produces endurance. So let endurance complete its work, so that you may be complete and sound in all respects, not lacking in anything." So rather than resenting our trials, James says that they're serving a purpose. They're molding us and shaping us so that we can become complete and sound, not lacking anything in Jehovah's eyes. Generally, though, hindsight shapes and covers over the pain of that molding process. We can think back fondly to times where we've had life lessons, where we've received some counsel or discipline and we've benefited and we've grown from it. But notice in verse 2 that the joy doesn't come from looking back at how far we've personally grown. The joy comes as we meet, as we're going through and undergoing this molding process. Well, how can that be the case? Well, in our verse, in verse 3, it talks about how our faith produces endurance. Endurance comes from developing spiritual qualities and being able to put our faith in Jehovah into action. So just for a moment, to illustrate this point, think about a Bible character that we can relate to, maybe with our Raw at the moment. Maybe it's one of these ones that we can see on our screen. Samson there on the far left, he was physically weak and was suffering the consequences of making a bad decision. Ruth was a caregiver and she had to work hard to provide for her family. David felt alone. Jesus faced temptation. When we think about a Bible character, likely we also think of the quality that they showed. For example, Samson had faith and relied on Jehovah's Spirit. Ruth worked hard and was loyal. David was humble. Jesus was courageous. Those qualities helped them to rise above the challenge that they faced. So when we think of our Bible character that we've identified, that can help us to see what quality we can use in our current challenge. And that can help us to have something really powerful because it can help us to shift our focus onto something that we can control. We might not be able to control our circumstances, our past, or the reactions of others, but we can control our thinking and what we do. By being more aware of opportunities to cultivate spiritual qualities and putting them into practice, we can be this refined person that becomes complete in Jehovah's eyes. And that can really be a source of joy for us. Well, our final area and source of joy is in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. There it says, "For God is not unrighteous so as to forget your work and the love you showed for his name by ministering and continuing to minister to the holy ones." Jehovah sees us and values what we do as an individual. He sees every tear we've shed, every negative thought we've had to battle against. He loves us for who we are and what we do for him. And he doesn't just remember what we've done in the past, how we've ministered, but he sees how we're ministering, our ongoing, continuing struggles that we're going through now. When we sense Jehovah's approval, when we think about how he values what we do, that can give us inner satisfaction that can motivate us, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable trials. And that's well illustrated by the example of our dear brothers in Eritrea. Currently, 20 of our brothers have spent some over 17 years in prison for their neutrality without charge. And a few years ago, a group ranging from 20 to 80 years of age wrote about their situation that they were in. And this is what they said of their circumstances. They said 28 of us are in a semi-underground room, 7 meters by 5 meters wide. The food they provide us is not nutritious. Water is scarce, and due to the hot weather averaging over 45 degrees, our sweat runs like a waterfall that sometimes makes us dehydrated and eventually leads to unconsciousness. The unsanitary conditions expose us to sickness, and on top of that, from time to time, we receive despicable, harsh, and brutal treatment from the authorities. With the additional daily forced labor without break, you cannot imagine what life looks like here. Well, how did our brothers, or how were they sustained by knowing that Jehovah was not unrighteous to forget their works? Well, this is what they said. Despite the harsh conditions, we are united and not one of us has ever complained. In the semi-desert place, Jehovah has proved to be with us. After all, did not he promise us in Isaiah 58:11, saying, Jehovah will always lead you and satisfy you, even in the parched land. He will invigorate your bones. We know Jehovah sees our affliction and will not tolerate our pain forever. Our help is in the name of Jehovah, the maker of heaven and earth. As Jehovah, the Almighty, is our God, we can assure you that we are like a green plant that bears fruit in this desert. Amazing expressions of faith, aren't they? Despite the hardships that they had, they were able to have joy knowing that Jehovah was deeply invested in their trials. He saw everything that they were enduring, and they knew that he wouldn't allow it to continue forever. Just as Jehovah won't allow our trial to go on eternally. In fact, our verse here in verse 6 says that Jehovah would view it as a sin. It would be an act of unrighteousness for him to not recognize and notice the struggles and the battles that we're enduring with. And for him to forget would be unrighteous. But even further than that, in Hebrews 11, verse 6, Jehovah is described as the rewarder of those earnestly seeking him. And as our rewarder, he cannot wait to bless us and wipe away all the pain and the hardships and the memories that we've suffered. So as we go through our trials, we can build up our joy knowing that Jehovah approves of us and that we have a wonderful hope that Jehovah holds out as our rewarder. Well, let's just go back to our roar from Satan for a moment. Maybe when we think of that challenge, it still brings up feelings of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. And the reality is, in the world under Satan's control, we may have to battle against that feeling, whether it's because of this trial or others in the future, until Jehovah steps in. But can we share a really positive thought together in Nehemiah 8 and verse 10? Nehemiah 8 and verse 10, just almost at the end of our verse there. It says, and do not feel sad. Don't be afraid. Don't give up. Why? For the joy of Jehovah is your stronghold. In our illustration, we can see a stronghold there. It doesn't take away an attack. As strong as that lighthouse is, it won't stop the waves from rolling in. But a stronghold does give a feeling of security and safety. And that's what our joy can give us. That's the joy of Jehovah that can be our source of strength. So when we put into practice the points we've considered today, when we prayerfully rely on Jehovah and prove our loyalty to him, when our spiritual routine helps us to gain Bible truths, when we use trials to help us cultivate spiritual qualities, and when we remember that Jehovah never forgets our sacrifices, then the joy of Jehovah will be our stronghold. And nothing can take that away from us. No person, no place, no situation. Our joy can shield us from the deluge of negative thoughts and emotions and give us strength to be able to keep on enduring. So with the assurance that we have Jehovah's smile of approval, may we always rejoice.